Welcome everybody to this week's Griscom stream. David here. Hope you're doing well wherever you are. New setup, y'all. Hope you like it. I'm still working out some of the kinks, but I'm definitely pretty happy with what I've been able to set up here. Don't worry. I always promised I was not going to be one of these book boys who just sits behind a wall of books. Very, very soon I'll be able to put a little bit more personal flair on this, but for now, this is the setup. We've been, I'm sure people, regular listeners of Left Reckoning will know we've been having a lot of technical difficulties lately, so figured it was time to make a couple investments and up the system a bit. So be patient with me as we start to shift some things over. But yeah, y'all, we got some I got some fun stuff I want to talk to y'all about today. Just a couple quick things up at the top. We got Ben Burgess for our bonus episode this week, coming out this Sunday for patrons. He will be joining us to talk about the false promise of right-wing populism. It's always great to have Ben on the show, so be sure you keep your eye out for that, coming out Sunday for patrons. As always, people know you can get our Left Reckoning merch now is up for sale at leftreckoning.com/store. I'm really excited. I think some of those are starting to get out. So if you, I'm sorry for, I'll have to figure this out later, but the camera's a little shaky. But if you have gotten your Left Reckoning merch, we'd really appreciate it if you share some photos on social media. We'd like to see some of y'all's beautiful faces in our Left Reckoning stuff. But let's see, y'all. I want to talk a little bit about some of the history of American socialism, because I think there's some really key lessons that we can draw from that. But before we get to all of this, I'll see, again, I'm on a new rig now, so hopefully I'm able to do this. But I was hoping to maybe see if I could share the first 2 minutes of the documentary that Matt and I have been working on. Patrons have already got a sneak peek of it. And it's a documentary on the question of left populism and sort of going through that history. Patrons Part 2 is on its way. I'm working hard on it right now. We're going to be taking a look at the Bernie Sanders and the Corbyn movement, seeing what went right with left populism and also what went wrong. But this first section that we put together was on sort of the history of how we got here. And I'm hoping that this is going to work for y'all. If it doesn't, please let me know. I apologize. Again, new system. Well, let's see. I'm just going to play the first couple minutes of this documentary for y'all.
People will only hear socialists insofar as they're able to speak to them in terms of things that can change their lives in the short run, affect them in the short run, offer them real reforms. And yet, given what's happened in the history of working class institutions, I don't just mean communist parties, I mean social democratic parties, I mean trade unions, we don't have the institutional apparatus to even offer those reforms, let alone build the types of working class capacities to do more than that. It's a depressing story.
Y'all, we need to talk about where we are. Serious attempts have been made in this past decade to build a different kind of politics globally. And it's notable, too, that it's been happening right here in the United States, a country where the organized left has been downtrodden for generations. Bernie Sanders and that movement reintroduced a much-needed working class politics into this country. But that movement also lost twice. And we can talk about the reasons as to why, the structure of the Democratic Party, but we also need to take serious the lessons that we learned during this process. Because now, Joe Biden is the president, and not only is he incapable of vanquishing the far-right threat, in the midst of all of this crisis, when everything feels like it's in flux and there's more and more demand for radical solutions to our deep-rooted problems, Joe Biden and the Democratic Party are united in administering this kind of limp, sleepy, tired politics to a country that has an appetite for something much, much different. Changing society is difficult and long, y'all. But I always remind folks that socialism is an inherently optimistic philosophy that of all of this misery, out of all of this crisis and chaos, that if we can organize a working class movement, not only can we uplift people and give them a bit of a better life, but we can actually achieve something that has been unseen in human history, a world where everybody's needs are met, where human potential can actually flourish. But if we're serious about achieving that, we have to be learning the lessons from the movements that have come before us, and most importantly, the lessons from this past 10 years of politics, because we have a future to win. To get to where we are, I think it's worthwhile to spend just a couple minutes breaking down where we came from. For a long time on the Marxist socialist left, there was this belief that capitalism itself was on the verge of the final crisis, and that it was important to organize around this kind of thing, but it was inevitable that socialism was on the horizon. Looking back now, we can see that that view was a bit mistaken. At the end of the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels wrote, "The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite." And you read something like that, and it's very hard not to, in the year 2022, to wonder what happened. Where did that kind of inevitable revolution go? And this becomes part of a very dominant thought at the end of the 1800s and in the early 20th century, that capitalism, under the weight of its own contradictions, was going to implode upon itself. But this view turned out to be wrong, and most of the people who promoted it, at least the ones who were successful in the names that we know, learned that it was worthwhile to reject this thought process. Here's Leo Panitch actually breaking down why some of the early claims that capitalism was in its final phase in the 1800s was a bit premature.
What Sam Gindin and I have written concerning the Marxist misreading of capitalist development in this period, and I mean the Marxist one, as opposed necessarily to Marx's, right, is very relevant here. What Engels was already articulating in 1887 was much reinforced by the classic writings by Luxemburg, Hilferding, Bukharin, and Lenin in the subsequent decades. Little known is how much they were indirectly influenced by American mainstream economists in the mid-1890s, who, taking the famous thesis on the closing of the frontier as gospel, looking at the great downturn of 1894, concluded that accumulation had reached its limits even in the United States. This is before there was even hardly any accumulation in California. And it was on that basis that indeed the State Department developed the notion that America needed to be invading Central America, ripping off its resources in order to provide a surplus for the United States. It was absurd. The notion that Nicaragua was going to provide that kind of surplus when California was hardly yet a source of accumulation. Right? But Hobson adopted this in his book of Imperialism. He was influenced by that literature. And all of the rest of the Marxists were influenced by that literature in reading Hobson. The notion that capital had reached the limits of accumulation in the advanced capitalist countries was a fundamental mistake of that era of Marxism. It had enormous strategic consequences. Because although the Bolshevik Revolution is to be much praised, as China Mayville says in his outstanding book, which everyone should read, his New History of October, which Verso has just published on the centenary of the Bolshevik Revolution. As he says, anybody who makes a break that way with what Marxists thought would be the pattern of revolution can hardly be accused of following a teleology. Absolutely. But he made that break consciously, clearly, repeatedly saying, we're making it on the basis of the assumption that capitalism has reached its highest stage, and by breaking the weak chain here, we will induce a revolution in Germany. So the assumption that even Lenin was making was that capitalism was on its last legs.
So there you'll have it. That was a little sneak peek from this documentary that patrons have already gotten the part one of. If you want to see the full thing, you can get that at patreon.com/left reckoning. Part two, where we take a kind of more in-depth look into what the Bernie Sanders and the Jeremy Corbyn moment not just meant, like in a, in the sense of what it meant to our hearts, but what it actually meant for political strategy, where some of those, what some of the successes are that we should be learning from and building off of, and what some of the pitfalls were of that kind of strategy of reinvigorating working class politics in both the United States and the United Kingdom, effectively top down, right, using big party structures to do that. I think these are the only real important questions. Everything else matters tremendously in its effects on people's lives. But for us on the left right now, the question has to be, how can we build a vehicle and a movement that is capable of taking some of the ideas that we have, which are good and correct, and bringing them into practice? And I know people who've been watching me for a few years may have noticed my sort of shift on this, and it's not been a shift about my convictions or my beliefs, but I've become much more concerned, less with sort of winning certain kinds of arguments, but more with how do we actually move from the point of where we're just sort of arguing amongst each other into actually building vehicles that can win power and affect change for working people. But yeah, if you want to see the rest of that part one documentary, you can get that on our Patreon. I'm sure at some point we'll release it to the public, and part two, for people who saw part one, will be coming out soon. But yeah, y'all, these are a little bit more casual, so feel free to jump into chat with any kind of questions or topics that you might want to hear us discuss. I did have something sort of queued up that I want to talk about, which is a bit about the history of the American socialist movement that I think has a hell of a lot to do, has a hell of a lot of lessons to teach us right now. So unless anyone has any questions up top, we can jump into that, which I guess we will. Because this is a really important story, and like a lot of these debates that we're having on the left, particularly about these kind of individualist, moralistic views of politics versus ones that are sort of rooted in the class and rooted in the kind of political theory that can win. Um, I think there are some tendencies here that have actually been with us, and not just on the American left, but on the international left for a very, very long time. And I think to highlight this, and again, if you have comments or questions, jump in with those, and I'll try to take them as we're going. I want to go through a little bit of the history of the American socialist movement, because I think it has a hell of a lot to teach us right now. Notably, the early history of what was the precursor to what y'all might know as the Socialist Party of America, the party of Eugene Debs, probably one of the most, at least electorally, successful American socialist parties in our history. And, we've done a lot of streams on this, talked about the relationship between that movement and the early Farmers Revolt, the Farmers Alliance, and the populist movement in this country. Um, but So this isn't going to be an entire history of all of that. It's going to be a history of one of the first and major splits in the American socialist movement that has a lot to teach us. So just to get everybody on the same page, let me break this down a little bit for y'all. So the Social Democratic Party of America, and just right quick, I know sometimes a lot of people hear, certain kind of buzzwords and they associate a lot of historical baggage with them. Remember that social democracy was, for most of like the 19th and even early 20th century, what most socialists and communists were calling themselves. It was only much later, when you started to see the cracks in the social democratic movement, that you then started to see people like Lenin identifying themselves strictly as members, as communists, right, in opposition to what was happening within the social democratic movement. So just whatever kind of forward baggage that you might associate with that word, I would advise you to drop it. to be able to understand this movement. But the Social Democratic Party of America was was something that came out of years and years in struggle. It came out of a few movements, notably out of an increase and a militant shift in the labor movement, where the idea of labor peace, and for people who aren't familiar with that term, it was a kind of thesis that, in the early trade movement era in the United States, was that, capital and labor are two sides of the same force, and basically the job of the union movement was actually to find a way to create common ground and unite them for the betterment of all. But as you saw, in the early history of the American labor movement, the brutal crackdown on labor brought many people like Eugene Debs, who was a believer in the thesis of labor peace, to the realization that this wasn't possible, and instead politics has to be fought on a class basis. Now, in the Social Democratic Party of America, there were other tendencies as well. There were utopian tendencies, and there were also anarchist tendencies. And the anarchists, in particular, had done a lot of work for workers. And there was this demand that there needed to be a vehicle in the building of a party, very similar to some of the conversations that we're having right now in this country. In 1897, there was a convention of the American Railway Union, and during which Debs made this speech. And I apologize, I had a cute little slide for y'all. Well, actually, let's see if I can pull that up. Again, I'm on my new system now, so I am a little bit. I'm not as fast as I used to be on the draw, but let's see. Lord in heaven. All right, y'all can see the behind the scenes look. How about that? The Debs made this speech towards the end of the convention, outlining the missions of the social democratic movement. The mission of social democracy is to awaken and to give is to awaken and give him courage. Talking about workers. Sorry, the mission of social democracy is to awaken to a consciousness that he is a socialist and to give him courage, um, courage by changing his conditions. I have not changed in regard to our procedure. Give me 10,000 men, 1,000 in Western state, with access to the sources of production, and we will change the economic conditions, and we will convince the people of that state, win their hearts and their intelligence. We will lay open the reins of government and plant the flag of socialism on the state house. The state government in this offers us an advantage that is not found in any European country. We can take possession of one state and not wait until we get the whole of the United States. We must get one state at a time. In a movement such as this, there is always some friction. We're in the birth throes of a new movement, the most responsible movement of the world the world has ever saw, and it demands the most careful of consideration of honest men and women. So he gives the speech, and sounds super good. If you don't have the context, you might not know who he's addressing here. He is addressing another tendency that showed up in the Social Democratic Party. Um, at the initial convention, there was a split between two forms of politics, right? One more aligned with the utopian socialists and anarchists who were favoring what was called colonization, um, and class war politics, which was favored by the socialist faction. And just to help people understand what colonization means, and I I would suggest that you also think about some contemporary examples of this, because this is a tendency that has not gone away. Colonization was this idea that the United States has so much land that socialists and anarchists and utopians could go out, particularly out to the West, and build a community based around socialist principles, right? Create a society of mutualism and effectively create these societies where people might prefer to live and encourage people to move to them to basically create two countervailing poles in American society, one of capitalist exploitation in the industrial cities, and one of utopian agrarian socialism out in the countryside. This was a very, very popular idea in the late 1800s with a lot of people on the left. And again, I challenge you to think maybe about some kind of contemporary analogies to certain political tendencies that are sort of desiring the same kind of thing, because Eugene Debs and others pushed back against this. One, they recognized the futility of this, right? That one, it wasn't going to work on its own merits. And two, recognizing that the concentration of industrial power had led to the incredible world historic opportunity. And this is one of the fundamental contradictions of capitalism, is that it's a system that produces incredible amounts of abundance, but that abundance is only enjoyed by a small few of the class. And most alienating to folks is the fact that the people who actually do the labor to produce that abundance are left out of the proceeds. Right, this is like fundamental to Marxism, is that workers create all of this wealth, all of this abundance, and yet they go hungry, yet they suffer, yet they die at younger ages than the unproductive classes, the capitalists. So Debs and the socialists recognized that this had not only a utopian bent to it, but it was also extremely impractical, not only because they didn't think that it would work on its own on that scale, but two, they recognized that there was something really important that they were leaving on the table. They were leaving the industrialization that working people had created, this technological revolution, this labor revolution that had allowed for the first time the ability to actually meet the needs of people in society. We weren't in scarcity times anymore, and scarcity was something that was created rather than something that was natural. And they recognized that the challenge of working people was actually to try to take control of those levers of power and utilize them under democratic, worker controlled ownership for the betterment of the rest of society. This disagreement ended up splitting the party. Um, because the pro-colonization sides were tirelessly organizing to get complete control of the party, because they were wanting to pursue this kind of idea of let's go all go out to the west and buy a gold mine, and create our utopian society. And two, they were extremely allergic to the work of doing electoral politics and of electoral politics, and to a lesser extent doing popular trade union politics. The side that was pro political action ended up leaving the first convention or the second convention. There's a whole bunch of history here that I don't think is super worthwhile getting into. I think the main threads are what's important. But the side that was pro political action ended up leaving the second convention, and they held their own and accepted these principles, which I'll read right now because I think this is an incredible document. You can find it online, Marxist.org. It's called the Declaration of Principles of the Social Democratic Party, and I'll just read the first few. One, revision of our antiquated federal constitution in order to remove the obstacles to full and complete control of government by all the people, irrespective of sex. Two, public ownership of all industries controlled by monopolies, trusts, and combines. Three, public ownership of all railroads, telegraph, telephone, all means of transportation, communication, waterworks, gas and electric plants, and all other public utilities. Four, the public ownership of all gold, silver, copper, lead, coal, iron, and all other mines. Also, of all oil and gas wells. And think about that for a second. If we had taken all of that material wealth that we had in this society, put that under public ownership in 1898, what that would have meant for the future and the society that we're living in today. Five, reduction of the hours of labor in proportion to the increasing facilities of production. Six, the inauguration of a system of public works and improvements for the employment of a large number of the unemployed, the public credit to be utilized for that purpose. Seven, all useful inventions to be free to all, the inventor to be remunerated by the public, which is an incredible idea, and much better than the extremely conservative and reactionary system we have right now of patents, which basically hold off human knowledge from the rest of society. Eight, labor legislation to be made national instead of local and international where possible. Nine, national insurance of working people against accidents and lack of employment and old age. 10, equal civil and political rights for women and the abolition of all laws discriminating against women. Remember, this is in 1898. 11, the adoption of the initiatives and referendum and the right of recall of representatives by the voters. 12, abolition of war as far as the United States are concerned, and introduction of international arbitration instead. An incredible set of demands there. And they also had, because again, this came out, a lot of these people were very loyal and had also come up in the populist movement through the Farmers Alliance, this great movement of agrarian and working people in the countryside. They also had a separate set of demands for farmers. One, no more public land to be sold, but to be utilized by the United States or the state directly for the public interest, or at least to farmers in small parcels of not over 640 acres. Two, construction of grain elevators, magazines, and cold storage buildings by the nation to be used by the farmers at cost. Three, the postal, railroad, telegraph, and telephone services to be so united that every post and railroad station shall also be a telegraph and telephone center. Telephone service for farmers as for residents of cities to be at cost. Um, Four, a uniform postal rate for the transportation of agricultural products on all railroads. Five, public credit to be at the disposal of counties and towns for the improvement of roads, soil, and for irrigation and drainage. It's absolutely an incredible document, and the people who ended up, selecting and endorsing these proposals ended up splitting from the Social Democratic Party split into two different factions. But the people on the pro politics side, the people who were endorsing this set of policies, went on to be early founders of of the Socialist Party of America. And I bring this up, um, one, because I think it's a really important historical document. I think it's important for people to recognize that socialism, these demands that we're making now, um, have always been here. Two, to see how radical and also practical the demands that were coming from socialists of that era were. Right. I think that, like, we need to be able to be thinking about two things at once. Right. One, what is our version of things like construction of grain elevators and magazines and cold storage buildings by the nation? Right. What are our ideas about land use? Right. What are our kind of like practical radical policies, rather than just sort of nudging progressive Democrats to maybe do something a little bit nicer, having a platform on our own? And of course, you need an institution and you need a party to really be able to do that, for it to have any teeth. But it's like this kind of opening of thinking and radical thinking, particularly, the demand for farmers that we use public credit to improve the lives of everyday people. Right? These are things that we desperately need to be revisiting and starting to think practically about how we take some of the convictions that we have into the realm of policy. But this second bit, um, and look, I'm not trying to be nitpicky or anything like that, but this also shows, I think, a tendency that is historical amongst not only the American left, but also the European left. That there have always been a side of folks who say we need to engage in politics, we need to engage in industrial action, and we also need to be seizing the means of production to utilize them, not to shut them down, to utilize them to better human life. This is the tradition of the socialist movement in this country, in Soviet Russia, um, all across the world. This has been the demand of working people and working class parties. And there's always been this kind of movement that what we need to do is sort of get back to a simpler life and go back to the land. And look, I love that stuff just as much as the next guy. I don't think that's a big surprise to anybody. But that's not a political movement. Capital is very happy for you to go and create a like kind of personal commune. There's another kind of fetish with this, where people think that the way that we overtake the industrial sector is less so returning to the land. But if we just create a competing system of worker-owned co-ops, that will somehow be able to swallow up the whole of capitalism. I'm sorry, y'all, that won't happen. I think worker co-ops are great, and I think if you're in the position to be able to seize control, um, to seize control of of your workplace and take that under ownership of the people working there, I think that's a wonderful thing. But this kind, like, for that to actually be the national political strategy of how we overtake those industries, is just going through a slow legal process of turning one coffee shop, one shirt making thing or whatever into worker co-ops and having them compete on the capitalist market. I think that that's a little bit of a mistake. um, Debs recognized that there was an importance in seizing the industrial system that working class people created. Debs realized that there was a value in the abundance that can be created under this certain mode of production. And what we should be doing, instead of trying to destroy that, is actually take that under our control so that we can better utilize that abundance for the benefit of the people who create value in the society. And I'm going to go over to questions and comments. So if you've asked something, I'll be responding to in just a second. But I just ask folks to think about this because, if anything, I think one of the most, apart from like the inspiration and like the ideas that are coming out of this period of time, I think it's also notable to see that there's one group of people that now, and that was the Socialist Party of America. That, look, they didn't win outright. They lost. They faced extreme brutal opposition, but they did fundamentally change the shape of politics in this country, because the demands of the Socialist Party got watered down, certainly, but they got materialized in some form through the New Deal. Now, I don't think that that's the end all be all. I think we need to be demanding and hoping for much more than that. But if you see what group ended up having the largest effect materially for working people in the United States, it was the Socialist Party, which fundamentally changed the political makeup of the country in the early 20th century, and then saw some of the ideas that they put forward realized into actual policy later. The colonization folks, the people who thought that we could just create like a nice little river commune in Colorado or wherever, they don't know about them. A few of them did it, and I'm sure it was nice, but that didn't do very much to alleviate the suffering of the millions of working people in this country. Um, and I think that these are two different paths that have always been here in the socialist movement from the time of Marx, throughout socialist parties in Europe. There have always been these kind of tendencies between people who say we need to put our energies and focus on trying to win political and trade union power for working people, so that we can utilize the benefits of society for the people instead of for the benefit of this ruling class. And there's always been a tendency that says, you know what, why don't we just create our own little thing on the outside? And there's one group of people who have changed the face of politics and society in the past 150 years. We need to do much more. There's lessons and there's failures and things to learn from that. And there's one group of people who you don't really know about. And I think it's really crucial to recognize that, because I think that, we might be a couple years behind it, but we are much closer to like an 1898 moment in this country than a 1917 moment. And we need to be building the institutions and the capabilities of working class people to take control of their lives and to have a vehicle for engaging in politics that's based on working class basis. And we need to drop all this other nonsense and utopian stuff that has never gotten the goods for people. Let me see what we have here in the chat. I appreciate everybody sticking around for that. I think this is just what's been on my mind, and I hope that that was helpful. I'd love to do more on it um, in the future if that's something that's of interest to folks. But let's see. I'll roll back. I'll do that later, MDR. MDR wants me to pick out a book that doesn't go with the rest. J. Andrew World wants to know if I've checked out the Earthships. I know about the Earthships. I mean, that's been going on for a little while. It's around the corner for me. I mean, I think it's interesting. I'm a little bit, if I'm being honest, doubtful about the utilization of that on a mass scale, frankly. Marco says, are there any socialist candidates that are running in the South that have caught your attention? I'm definitely looking at Odessa Kelly, Charles Booker, Gary Chambers, to name a few, but I agree that the left needs to focus on the South to win national elections. I mean, I think most of those folks are pretty good. I think that they're, a little bit more on the progressive left side than on the social side. I think, as we saw with a certain election in New York, it also matters a lot to me how embedded you are with political movements instead of just sort of being a champion of certain ideas. I think those people are great. I actually don't know Odessa Kelly, if I'm being honest, but I liked a lot of the stuff that Booker has been doing in their campaigns for Kentucky Senate, for Senator of Kentucky. Gary Chambers has an incredible ad makeup for sure. I think there's a lot more that needs to be done. I mean, there's plenty of politicians I can think of who I like. I like Greg Casar, who's running for Congress here, is likely to win. He sort of came up out of the DSA. There's some tensions, and he sort of left it over his positions on Palestine. But I think that he genuinely holds like a progressive pro working class politics, and I think that he'll be a great congressman. But I think that we need something a little bit more rooted than that right now. And if I were to be, championing anybody, I want to find somebody more like that. And Marco says, I know these are more progressives and not necessarily socialists, but I mean, there's a lot of great, I think the progressive movement in the South is also extremely heartening. I think that right now our challenge is to build something even stronger. Um, let's see, y'all. Can you imagine Eugene Debs advocating a vote for Joe Biden? This represents just how profoundly lost the American left is today. Well, I mean, Eugene Debs was around for many, many different chapters of American politics. If you're trying to actually make the comparison, right? I mean, I don't know if this charge is sort of laid at my feet. I was never somebody who was saying that I think that you have to do that. And I wasn't pushing for it. I think that it made a lot of the arguments that people were making made sense to try to weaken the power of the Trumpist right. But I also think that on both sides of that, there is like too much of a fetish about what you're doing when it comes time to voting for president. I say that for the people who were like really going hard on trying to discipline the socialist movement all and to sort of fall in line with Biden. And I also say the same thing about people who really fetishize their ability to go and choose a candidate who's polling at 2%, um, who isn't rooted in a working class movement. I think when you're doing something like that, it's like the least interesting political moment of your life, frankly. I find those arguments to just be extremely tedious and boring, and don't really get us anywhere close to moving forward. Thanks, Trey, for the super chat. Certainly appreciate that. Sorry, it's always funny when y'all send us emojis. They just give us the text version. Um, Michael Newman has a good argument here. Public ownership of the internet administered by the post office. I'm all for public ownership of the internet. I think that that is something that we desperately need. I think most social goods should be publicly owned at this point. And we need to be fighting for, utilities like internet to be publicly controlled. And most certainly, if we want to build any kind of Green New Deal politics, um, the electrical grid. Charles Ghost says, "Should I unionize a Walmart?" I think that that would be wonderful if you can do that. I think that doing rank and file work is very worthwhile. Know that it's one extremely difficult to win there, and two, um, we had on Charmaine Chua and I'm forgetting our friend's name from Amazonians United, which is a group I think in a few different places, but they were talking from Chicago that's trying to do more serious labor organizing there as well. And he had a piece of advice for people who are interested in doing that kind of political work, union work, is that if you want to go into a community like that and you want to push for unionization, you need to be in it. And what I mean by that, it can't just be like a quick phase where you're going to try something out for 3 months. You need to be building trust and also recognizing that if you're trying to organize people, you're asking them to make tremendous sacrifices in the near term for a much better future in the long term. And if you're serious about doing that, you'd also need to be committed to them in the long term as well. But yeah, if you're working there, I think that's really well, good place to be doing stuff. Our good friend in Australia with the joke says, "Morning, boss. May Milton Friedman bless your day." Thank you for the blessing. Trey says we need real networks of community centers and social solidarity groups that are both politically and labor organizing oriented. I totally agree. But I also say the next challenge is actually being class rooted versus class focused. Like these things also need to be coming out of and for and from the working class. And I, I I think that's like a very crucial thing that's oftentimes missed because we can't just create more NGO networks that are speaking for people. We know how well that's turned out for the American left. Justin wanted to know about the merch if it's union made. I'd like to get that set up soon, but right now it is not. but we're working on trying to get a system set up to do that. Um, but it might take a little bit of time. And Trey also has a good second here. He says, I'm a small town communist, 1,300 people, and I feel like that is the simplest place to start if folks have connection to small communities. I totally agree that I think that these things need to be blossoming everywhere. I mean, in the Eugene Debs speech that, I spoke about, he said, give me 1,000 people in a Western state. And we'll be able to plant the flag of socialism on the state house, right? I think that like we have to be reclaiming that kind of idea of Debs that like this movement needs to be happening everywhere. It can't just be concentrated in a few of the big cities. And those communities, not all of them, a lot of them have been completely decimated. I highly suggest if you haven't seen our conversation with Nick Boland about how Democrats have lost the rural working class. To see the what's happened to most working class people, where that sociability, where that civil society has been sort of ravaged by capitalism and neoliberalism, but in places where that still exists, I think that's a very viable place to be doing work. This is a good question. Is there a main book or a couple books that goes with this topic of electoral politics versus the other isolated technique? Well, if you wanted to know a little bit more about the history of of like the Social Democratic Party in America and the Socialist Party, send me a message and I can send you a couple. Um, if you're looking for like a broader book on political strategy, I think a great place to start is I always suggest this book and I always forget the title. It's by Leo Panitch and Sam Gindin. It's Syriza, Corbyn, and Bernie Sanders. Um, Let me pull it up for y'all so I get the title right. I'm horrible with titles, I have to admit. The Social Challenge today, Syriza, Corbyn, and Sanders. I think that's an excellent starting off point if you're wanting to look um, at strategies for actually building movements that are more politically oriented and more class rooted. And it is contemporary, so it uses examples that you might know a little bit better than stuff that happened 100 years ago. Brandon says, thanks for sharing this stuff. I'm working on starting a YDSA chapter at my school and hope to show your content at meetings. Schools at Metro State in Minnesota. So if anyone there watching from a Metro State, keep your eye out. Let us know how it's going, Brandon, and let us know if we can do anything to help. J. Andrew World on Earthship says, I'm critical of Earthships too. I think the main problem is that it's very rugged, individual, libertarian. However, the idea of using these ideas to build off into a socialist community, it could work. I'm just like, for me, I'm very focused on the macro these days when it comes to environmental policy. Um, but I mean, they're really cool structures and it's definitely interesting. Camus says, I work in construction management. My office is very conservatively charged. How would one go about pushing left politics to warm them towards unionization? The PMC brain is real. How do we combat? Um, well, I mean, I think it's worthwhile to note where people's position is in like the sense of production and if it's even going to be a viable thing there. um I think that this is the general advice that I always give folks, is that when people are conservative, I think the most important factor you have to figure out is why. Is it about social stuff? Is it about like a genuine love of conservative economic policies? um is it regional, right? It's just like I always remind folks that, like, most people fall in line with whatever the generic politics of their region is. And I don't think that you should find it more difficult to pull people into socialist ways of thinking, who maybe grow up in like the South, in an area where most people consider themselves to be Republicans, than somebody who's grown up in like a New York City, for example. They consider themselves to be Democrat, because a lot of times those convictions are a little bit weak, or just sort of going with the flow. Um, to the policy stuff, I think there's there's two things there, right? Again, like you have to see if it's viable and even worth your time. But I would remind folks that, like, the ideology of like you have to work hard, you have to look out for yourself and your family is in the absence of working class politics. I mean, that's sort of what you do end up being left with, right? Right. I mean, like if you don't have a strong working class movement, if you don't have a government out there that will be looking out for you in times of crisis, like that's reasonable, right? You have to work. You have to work. You have to look out for yourself, because the system won't do it for you. The difference between our prescription and the conservatives is that the conservatives lionize that, while we say that's a bad thing and we deserve much, much more and can build that. And I find that to actually be a very viable pathway to take with people. It's like, yeah, of course, that's how these things are working, but is that good? Um, but I'd be curious to know more about how you're doing um, over there, friend. Sam says, I found most conservatives I know at their core are conservatives because of religion. These people can be very hard to convince, especially how twisted Christianity has become recently. I mean, I think that, like, we were talking about Lula in Brazil, um, and he's just not going to let the evangelical movement beat there. He's, quoting the book of Matthew to folks. So I think that, we shouldn't necessarily treat those as a lost cause. But I think that oftentimes, I mean, I'm not discounting your experience, too, that the religious roots of a lot of American conservatism can be a bit overstated. Not saying it's not a major factor, but the power that group has right now is actually not as strong as I think some people think. Trey has some good general advice: is ask people about what's going on in their neighborhood and at work. That's how you get folks on your side to begin with. 100%. That's like organizing 101. Like this is like neutral science of doing politics. Is you ask people what their issues are, and then you find a way to speak to them on what we're putting forward. Joe says there's a lot of conservative Baptists around here. So their conservatism is very tied up in religion, what makes it tough to get through to them. Yeah, and like, but this goes back um, to understanding, like the arenas of political conflict, because read the early populist stuff in America, read some of the stuff that Debs was talking about. There are a lot of allusions to parables and to the Bible in those, because they were speaking a common language that people understood, and um and speaking to them on their convictions of their faith. And what the right has done successfully has been to take, religion and to utilize it in that way, um, to bolster their view of the world, which is frankly very incongruent, with a lot of scripture. And it's not something that you can do overnight. It's not something you're going to be able to do with like the perfect quote at the right moment. It's recognizing that what conservatives have understood for the past, 40 years of alienation and like desocialization of society, um, is that you need to own those kind of spaces and those communities. And I don't have the quick and easy answer as to how to do that right now. But recognizing that these things aren't permanent. These are things that have been purposefully constructed, and that's the challenge that's in front of us, is to find either utilizing existing structures or building new ones, that promote a sense of solidarity and community and class consciousness amongst people. Dakota says, speaking of class rooted politics, where do you think the sweet spot is between cultivating and constructing a coherent working class rooted formation and simply speaking for them? This is a good question. Because I think, for a lot of our movement, it's the latter, right? Speaking for folks. Like there are, like, not to single Thomas Frank out, who I have a lot of respect for, but that book, "What's the Matter with Kansas?" I think, which fundamentally makes the argument that why Kansas ended up losing its progressive bent is because the Democratic Party abandoned the working class, right? So I think the historical thesis there is certainly correct. But even in the way that that phrasing is sort of put forward, and maybe less frank, but more the way that people talk about that book, people just cite that. They just say the title. What's the well, why does the working class quote unquote vote against their interests? Um, and they're like, well, what's the matter with Kansas? Um, I think that that's a very bad way to look at politics, because what we should be doing as socialists is asking why frustration is manifesting itself in the way that it is politically, right? And also recognizing and having the courage to understand that class consciousness is something that is not innate, it's something that is built. um, so recognizing where the class is going, what people are thinking, and remembering that the working class as it is constituted right now is not hegemonic. And what I mean by that is, you know somebody being working class gives you a good sense about what they do for a living. It gives you a good sense about what happens to them at work. um, but because our political system and our political movements in this country are so disparate and are so you know unmoored from class politics, that you have like people with a lot of different thoughts. So like, there's no like one working class mind in America, and I think sometimes people start talking about it like that, and that's unhelpful. um, but I do think that it's worthwhile to recognize what's going on with the different sections of the class, and not just so quickly saying like, well, those aren't the ones, we don't like those ones, so we're going to ignore them. you know um Something Sam Ginden said in a podcast interview with Adam Proctor at the Dead Pundit Society has really stuck with me, where it's important for socialists to recognize what is a socialist in the current like state of affairs within the working class. Because I think you know, I totally agree with a lot of the criticisms of the PMC. I make those a lot on this program, but I think that that has actually started to become an analytical framework that can be very unhelpful, where everyone's trying to figure out like what percentage of like working class that you are. And I favor a very a pretty broad definition of that for the at least for the concerns of building the movement that we want. And what we should be asking ourselves is not when you're looking at sort of like who are the members of like the socialist movement right now. Well, a lot of them are workers, and they might not all be the kinds. They might overrepresent a certain segment of the working class. um, but I think that it's important to ask yourself the questions, okay, well, how do we expand this, rather than doing this kind of like self-defeating game where, if you do enough penance, you can be seen as like a real true one. um, but what Ginden said, I think, was really helpful. Is like, what is the socialist like? What is their role in the working class? And he was saying that we have to remember that socialists are like the voluntarist army of the working class. And what does that mean? It means these are the people who are willing to do the tedious, engaged work of participating in politics, strategizing, reading books, theorizing, organizing, etc. So these are people who are members of the working class who are extremely active. And yes, does that represent very small fraction of the American working class as it is currently constituted? Yes. So should there be, a lot of internal questioning and trying to figure out the puzzle of how to expand this so it represents more and more members of the working class? Absolutely. But we also can't fall into this other tendency that I think a lot of people fall into, which is like tailism, right? Where you say like, well, I'm just gonna, sit in the back and sort of tail what I think is happening. No, socialists have always been trying to push forward class consciousness, not just in this country, but everywhere, recognizing here's where the class is, here's where we need them to be, and trying to find ways to build that bridge to where we need to be. So that's like the real tension that we're in. Um, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if there's a small section of the people who of the group who believe this or that, right? Talking about socialists. What does matter is if we're able to build a movement that can win and deliver for people. And building that movement is how you get rooted. That's how you get rooted. You don't build that movement by constantly flailing around and questioning like the soul, like, if it's like a spiritual part of your body, like how working, am I the working class, right? Do I do this or that? I think recognizing that this is something that has to be constructed and built is a big part of that process. I know that was a long answer, but I hope that was helpful. Oh, Dakota had a second bit. Says just think of panaches on workers' political imaginations being limited by the lack of coherent working class, plus Matt Crispin workers' apathy and re-inspiring faith in the collective. Yeah, I mean, I think those are some good places to sort of start thinking about this. All right, I think I'm gonna have to leave in just a moment. I appreciate everybody sticking around. I think I'm digging the new setup. I'll have to mess around with some things, and I'll promise y'all I won't be a book boy. I'll get some fun stuff on these shelves, but I do think this is working out mighty fine. We got Ben Burgess on tomorrow. He's gonna be talking about the false promises of right populism. That'll be out for patrons on Sunday. Matt and I will be back next Tuesday with the main show. Really excited to share this conversation. We had Lillian Tercherchi on, excellent thinker. Um, I mean, I love having her on the program. She's phenomenal. She's joining us to talk about, a socialist um, understanding of abortion, where this movement has sort of failed, some of the conceptions that we need to be building to build a politics that make sure that these rights aren't under threat of annihilation like they are in this country. That'll be releasing next Tuesday. I think Matt's doing a stream tomorrow too. So if you need more of us, you can tune into that. And until then, y'all, I'll see y'all this Sunday.